And we are live. Hi, friends. Hope all is well for you. I'm so happy to be back here on YouTube so we can talk about decks. And I am with Max, the creator of MAGE cards. Today, he joined us so he can answer some questions we got and also share about MAGE cards, how we can use them, and so on. So, Max, welcome. What time
Thank
is
you.
it? Where are you exactly?
I'm on an island off the coast of the U.S. It's called Martha's Vineyard. It's where I'm kind of hiding out from the COVID-19 pandemic. So it's pleasant. It's nice here. Yeah,
It's
and it's
nice.
11 a.m. 11 a.m. So yeah.
It's pretty early for you.
Yeah, I work really late at night. So and last night was definitely a bender. So yeah, like this is morning for me. I'm drinking my coffee and it's good to talk to you.
Good. So tell us a bit about Mage cards and how you got to create them. How did you get that spark, and these inspirations?
Sure. Yeah. Well, I mean, that could have a very long answer or a more short answer, and I'll try for the more short answer. So essentially, I've been working through these processes for a very long time. I'm an artist that works with automatism pretty directly, and I've been doing that since I was a kid, really, in one way or another. But maybe about 5 or 6 years ago, I started to really invest myself more heavily in esoteric themes and archetypes as a way to communicate the kinds of stories that were coming out of that process. Prior to that, it was more literary and poetic, and then I came in contact with some people and started working in a mode that opened it up more to esoteric themes. So I really just was given a prompt by a gallery I work with in Belgium that they wanted a lot of cards in a very rapid, time period for a show that they were doing, or a lot of drawings. And so I went back to a technique I developed with a friend during this kind of ritualized process that we did, where I was pouring ink into these circles and letting forms manifest. And the first time I did this back in like 2014 with my friend, we were working with like Norse mythologies and magical systems as like a kind of prompt, and so it was all very wrapped up into that cosmology. And then this time when I did it, it was just much more free and loose. I sort of did it because it was something I knew how to do, and I was interested in trying it again, but I didn't have any direction for it necessarily. And it just started to flower into this space of like a really deep cosmology. I right away recognized that there was these like levels of creatures and beings, this kind of like ascending pantheon of like demigods and goddesses and mystical places. And it felt like it was this whole space of, kind of polymythic interpretation. And so once I sort of realized what was going on, I kind of identified the need to create a kind of subject, somebody that could be more like the actor, like who is I, or who is you in this space. And that's when I started to develop this idea of creating these like magely archetypes, or not really creating, but just sort of researching them and finding them. So I was using colored inks for these drawings, and I started to identify the inks as having this relationship to these kind of inner processes of mind and understanding of the world and building knowledge, and came up with the four internal color signifiers. And then I opened that up eventually and I kind of mixed those together to create the mages in different ways using like a research process. I could talk more about that, but I'll leave it for another time. And then so that was essentially the process. So eventually it flowered into this thing that was like not only a cosmology, but it also had this operational element where a person could jump in there and imagine themselves taking on these kind of vocations and costumes and interacting with these outer worlds deities. And that's when I started thinking, okay, this is really not just an art project. This is like a tool. This is like something that I want people to be able to use, and I want to experiment with it primarily. So I started to develop them as a deck that could be used to mix these different qualities and to kind of interpret and understand.
There are many beings. Let me just say that you have 62 cards in each deck. We have two decks. We have Mage cards 1 and we have Mage cards 2. And we have around 124 cards. There are a lot of beings in these cards. And some of them are really unknown. So how was the process of creating this and connecting with these beings? How was it?
Yeah, I mean, Uh, for me, it's really just part of my art process. Like I've been kind of like interacting, I think, with, I think of them sometimes as like entities and sometimes as like archetypes for a very long time. So it's very natural. It's mostly about like identification, and kind of like seeing their qualities and understanding like what they might represent, and then trying to listen for messages in their nuances, right? Like it's not just about identifying, okay, this is like a wind deity or something like that. It's more so like, what are the intonations of and subtle body postures and the way that he's interacting with the space around him in the drawing. That's kind of telling his story. Excuse me. So when I was working more poetically, often that would result in actual verbal transmissions. And for this, it was much more symbolic. It was more like, okay, this is like a symbol that's supposed to sort of like elucidate certain qualities about the form, and then hopefully transmit that to other people.
I find this really interesting. You just talked about a scene, and we notice on a lot of cards that there is a scene going on. There is something happening in the card. So how can we use that? Like for example, for this card, the daughter. What do you see? What is the movement that is going on in this card?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, there's a lot going on in them. The way that I read these cards is in a few different ways. I guess the first lens is the kind of collectively realized archetypal quality and historical quality of the idiom, right? So like a dowser is a historical, practice of divination, and it has certain modalities that, in this one, it's kind of like a particular form of dowsing using like a double pronged rod. So the other way that I think about it is about the colors. Like the colors that make up this card are mostly orange and blue. So those are colors representing gnosis and chaos. So for all of the divination mages, those are their constituent colors. So you can kind of see those two colors interacting and understand that that's like the basic underlying modality of this particular type of mage within my own kind of interpretation. I wouldn't say that this is how it is for everybody, or necessarily historically qualitatively like correct or anything. It's just sort of how I see it. And then the other things are just about body posture and some of the details. Like that double pronged rod is for me often about like kind of dichotomy and unification of dichotomy, and paying attention to dichotomies to create like a synthesis, or create like a dialectic. So and then the river is this like flux, of kind of material, or flux of, uh, of of the physical that occurs in the physical world along a temporal plane. So the dowser's role is also about like tapping into that, like understanding that things are changing, and interpreting movement across time.
I find it really interesting. And just hi, Fatma, thank you for being here. Also, it would be really interesting to look in a reading and seeing what is the position and where it is led into. We use a lot of this technique in readings and seeing the movement of the major character in the card. It is going to the left or to the right, to the next
Mm.
card, to the past, to the future. So I find it really interesting, these posters. And let me tell you that some faces, there is expression in their faces, which is really interesting.
Mhm.
Did you feel emotions or these expressions, or you have seen them? So how did it work regarding expressions and feelings in these cards?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like, my work usually has a bit of formation before I get to the character's expression. So normally I'm like reading from body language and posture to identify, concerns, and then I try to reflect that a little bit in the face. That's sort of just the way I work. So I don't identify an idea beforehand of what this character is going to be about. For a card like that, like I guess the Magely faculties, which were more about, they weren't as much about just like intuition. They were more about research, and understanding the way that the color associations were supposed to mix within that faculty. So a card like that dwarf card, I knew it was going to be a dwarf before I started drawing it, but I was also working with the chance processes of the ink,
Mhm.
basically just splashing ink over this grid, and, then trying to see figures in there. So the body posture is really coming out of, not my own intention necessarily. And then the background is sort of not coming out of my own intention. And then once I see the way that those things are interacting, the face is much more intentional usually. It's like, okay, what is this character communicating with their body language, and how can I evoke that through their expression?
Also, there is something different between some cards. I noticed. Let's say, for example, the occultist. The occultist, we see it. We see all the scene. We see what's happening. But in these, you were talking about the technique of drawing within a circle. So in some cards, we find it more like this. There are few like this. And others, the scene takes its place. We know what's happening. So, what is the difference between these two for you?
Sure. Well, that's a really good pairing to talk about that through, actually. So the one on the left, epochal transfer, that's what I've been calling an aspect. So it's part of the outer cosmology, but it doesn't have like a personification. It's more like a situation or like a mystical occurrence. And the one on the right, the occultist, is a magely faculty card. It's kind of like a persona or like a vocation or like a way of working magically with the world that a subject can adapt, that you or I could adapt. So the process of those two things working with each other is kind of the process for me of working poetically with the cards, or working to read the cards. So the occultist, having drawn this circle in the foreground, in a way that's a pretty good corollary for like what my process is to some degree. The occultist takes these, like, this is amassed knowledge of esoteric topics and magical thought from the past, and from and brings that into the circle to then sort of like imagine a space where something new can happen, or create a space where something new can happen. So yeah, that's how I would think of those two cards. That's sort of the general principle of the deck, is about theurgy, I think. So the occultist being like a subject that can then interact with these outer realms situations and gods and goddesses, etc.
And make something. There is a, I feel in these cards there is an invitation to action. It's an action deck. It's not just. I feel there is a lot of reflection that can be possible, but there is a lot of action going on. It's a word that is alive. Even sometimes we see you know. Some explosions we see so it is really inviting us to so the movement, the action, the history, the story of the card, I feel is really important in this deck.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think that that's like, working in the way that I do, as kind of like, I have a deep interest in kind of like symbolist art, and a way of making work that's somewhat literary, I suppose you could say. So there is like a thing happening, or a scene happening in every card. It's not just an inert persona. It's a persona that's interacting with environment and with props and tools and various other symbols that sort of like end up cataloging potential, I think, or end up cataloging like ways of thinking about that particular action. So certainly, yeah, these can be like a prompt for an action.
Um, we talk about two decks. We have Mage cards, and I have the proofs from the printer. So I have Mage cards 1 and Mage cards 2. How did you separate the cards? If you can tell us more about that, and just showing the decks that I know some people asked me about them. It's linen finished. So this is the boxes we have here, and the cards are plain cards, 330 GSM, and they are coated. So the printers are doing great job. You can shuffle them. You can use them. For us in Core Magic, which is important, is to use the decks. We are not producing and luxe cards that you can't use, that are really expensive. What is important for us is to produce decks that you can use. So I hope that answered questions, and you can see the cards further where we are talking. So yeah, so getting back to the decks. So what is the difference between Mage Cards 1 and Mage Cards 2?
Sure. Yeah. Mostly it's time. I think that when I was working through this process, it kind of happened in two phases. The first phase was, just probably the first year or so of making them. I was working with. I had just sort of like realized the potential of like the mages, and I had created 36 of them. And then I had quite a bit more of the outer realms kind of characters, the gods and goddesses and aspects and spells and various things like that. So I ended up just going back and doing it again, basically being like, I need to rebalance this. I need more mages. I need there to be like a better better balance. And I also wanted to investigate deeper. Like I had sort of just scratched the surface on many of these faculties. You know, I had created like, actually it was only 18 at first. I had created, you know, like 3 witchcraft cards and 3 wizardry cards. And it just felt like I wasn't like getting deep enough into like what the internal context and possibilities were within those threads. So the second sort of round of doing this work, you know, just sort of expanded from 18 to 36 in each majorly faculty. I also had at that point I had started working with these external color signifiers, which are not internal manifestations of knowledge. They're more so like teleologies or teloses that like kind of drive people to create and people to do different actions, I think. So I wanted, and I had 4 of those. And the way that I was doing the kind of math, to call it math is very generous to myself, but the way that I was mixing the colors together, like it behooved me to make 36 of those. So then I had another imbalance. So it was all just about creating balance and like creating a way to make these things balance out with each other correctly. And then when we decided to make this into 2 decks, it was just a process basically of like tracing the time at which these things had developed and categorizing out those two different kind of prongs of investigation that I had done. And I would say, like, in terms of like the qualities of the 2 decks, the first one definitely is more straightforward. A lot of the characters are more kind of like quickly identifiable. And then the second deck, that's an example from the second deck, are more deeply research based. So a lot of the majorly faculty characters are more esoteric and more, you know, kind of based on research rather than just like intuitive knowledge out of the popular space of you know, kind of magical identity. And the other thing about them is that the first deck has 2 specific subsets of beings. So it's got beings that are involved with the quality of techne, and then beings that are involved with the quality of noumena. And then the second one has a different set of beings. It's got beings that are involved with the quality of tulpa and of apieron. So I can talk more about those, but it would take a long time. So.
We created a post about it, and that we're gonna I'm gonna put it like today or tomorrow morning, so we can see what is these names Max is using. This is really something interesting in these 2 decks. Like you are bringing us teachings, like you are reminding us of some things that maybe we don't study necessarily in school or something like that, you know, that come from the popular history. So I feel like this deck is also could be a really good study deck.
Yeah, I think so too. I mean, it certainly was for me. Like, you know, in doing the research and trying to find ways to expand and identify sometimes the constituent qualities of a majorly direction, I've stumbled on a lot of really interesting kind of like unknown, at least to me, areas of magical history and sort of like theology and cosmology and all kinds of interesting stuff. So certainly, like, I feel like these the cards, you know, in the guidebook, I had tried to like create like a few sentences of context for them. But I think another way to approach them would certainly be through research. Like when you you know, come across a card that's really esoteric, like the Ophite, you know, like that's like a you know, a kind of like ancient religious.
I just got it.
Oh,
this is
that's
really
weird.
interesting.
That's strange. Yeah. So that's like when I was thinking about as an example of like something really something really esoteric that I had to research a lot, and I came across through kind of chance processes of research. And you know, it's a really interesting history and subject, and I interpreted it in a certain way, and I think historians would probably interpret it in a different way that could be very illuminating for people's readings and work with the cards.
Actually, for someone who doesn't know much about them and these esoteric archetypes, we have created also a guidebook. You have made a full guidebook with colors and with your insights, you know, with you sharing what you have learned also about this. Can you tell us more about the guidebook you have created?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, like, that was something that that you were really helpful with, actually. It was meant to like talk about, figure out how to talk through the voice of these cards in a way that was effective and felt like it was constructive and generative. So I went through each card and gave like a 2 or 3 sentence like description of how this card might be have buoyancy or presence within the cosmological space or the operational space. And then the rest of the guidebook is really about giving background to some of the other elements that help to develop the decks. So talking through the color associations, the meanings of these like internal and external kind of processes that the mages use to build knowledge and to build articulations of action. Talking through the mage lead faculties and some of the levels and kind of hierarchies that are within the pantheons. So all of that stuff to me, like as I've done readings and worked with the cards, have been very useful. Those are just ways that I've been able to like scaffold not only the construction of the cards, but also working with them through readings. But I think that in a way, like the guidebook is something that could be opened up further by interaction with individuals that are making readings in their own ways with the cards. I think, Osima, when we've talked, you've often had ways of looking at the cards, like as you were talking about the directionality and using directionality in a reading, like that's something that comes out of your knowledge of doing readings over time and could add a lot to the guidebooks. There's still a lot there, a lot to mine.
This is really interesting also to share, and that's why also one of the reasons we wanted to offer a course or workshop with these decks and the different ways to use them is also to create small Facebook group where we can start sharing our different practices and different also ways people can use them. It's so much in it brings a lot of richness. I don't know how to say it in English, but it brings a lot of insights when we do things together from this side. I am curious, how would you read, how would you use these cards for a reading? Can you maybe show us how you do a reading? Do you want me to mix the cards for you or like something quick? And of course, we can develop that in the workshop further.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I have a couple of different ways I've been using them, but probably the most applicable way here would be the 4-card reading that I just kind of made up, which is basically a line of 4 cards, and each of the 4 cards has a particular association to your state of being or the state of being of the object of the reading. I feel like I should say that I'm not like a very practiced tarot reader or oracle deck reader. I mostly use these for artistic means, for creating paintings and sort of like that kind of thing. But obviously I wanted to play around with them in the other way too. And so I have done quite a few of these readings and they've been pretty effective sometimes. So yeah, it's been interesting to go through that process and figure out how that can work. So if you want, we can talk about
and we are also offering some rewards that people can choose a reading with you. I think we have limited amount, and I think 6 or 7 are already gone. So if you want to meet Max and learn from him his way of reading, you can still do it in the Kickstarter campaign. All right, so do you want me to pick the cards for you, or you have your cards to do it?
I have my cards. They're like an earlier version.
The earlier version.
So it's up to you. Do you want to go through the older prototype or use yours? Why don't we use yours? I feel like that would be more.
Okay, let's. So there is something I want to do is mixing the 2 decks together.
Yeah,
I've been dying to do this, and as a card collector and creator, I mean having 2 decks together like this, 126 cards is.
Oops.
Is amazing to have them. But it offers so much possibilities. All right, so cutting the cards. So you want me to pick 4 cards? Let's maybe we can ask a question or something. What do you prefer?
Sure, however you'd like. Yeah.
Okay. Maybe a general question that maybe what should we need, or what do we need to know now, or what would be the message that we need, to knowledge or something like that.
Okay.
Okay, so 4 cards. Here we go. So here is the first card.
Okay, protogenic landscape. All right, so that is a that's a aspect card. So it's a particular kind of situation or temporal occurrence in the outer cosmology that has some kind of power or buoyancy or holding over humankind. So essentially, what that card means to me, and if it's occupying the first card location in the spread, I interpret that as being um, called the who you are. That's like the self, or what your being is at this time. So in terms of a subject, like what should happen, that is the thing that may be occurring. Protogenic landscape is about a very, very deep beginning that kind of works against like assumed structures in a kind of like evolutionary or very natural way to manifest a very deep level of newness. So it's about not about renewal. It's about like kind of the an explosion of change. So that's sort of like maybe the subject of this. So yeah, let's do the second one. That'll help illuminate. And this is about the tools. So this is the Covener. So the Covener is a witchcraft magely faculty. It's kind of an intermediary level. So it's part of like it means that the tools are fairly well developed, but they're not like at their apogee necessarily. But they are, the Covener is about community, and it's about like kind of like understanding like the intertwinement of individuals. So if that's the tool towards generating newness, then that means that community is important for creating whatever is supposed to transpire.
It feels like we are talking about our Kickstarter campaign.
Yeah. And then the
Yeah.
Ophite is the mountain. So that's pretty interesting. So the Ophite is it's a black magic card. So it's about extropy to some extent. It unites chaos and order in a way that is going to represent some change or some magical action. And the Ophite definitely it's a pretty complex card, and it's not one that I've ever felt like I understand fully, maybe because it's so esoteric. But to me, it kind of represents, and it's occupying the third space, which I think of as the mountain or the goal. So that's like what we're trying to attain through this process of change and community, is some kind of rupture or some kind of like kind of taking apart of a embedded knowledge base or something that might be kind of problematic, and being somewhat like destructive in the process of creating renewal. So I guess that even though protogenic landscape can mean like a flowering or a change of any kind, it seems like in this case it's sort of directed to taking apart a structure that's become negative or has become problematic. That's an ancient Gnostic sect, the Ophites. And then and that's also really interesting. So I consider the fourth card to be the mist, is what I call it, and that's the obstruction. So that's something that is going to be potentially clouding in this process. And the Pinnacle Demigoddess is a demigoddess, so she's of pretty high power, but also of a very particular kind of demigoddesses and demigods are often about like a kind of like an articulation of action, like almost like a civic action or something, whereas like gods are often more elemental. And so her particular action is one of ascension, of trying to get as high onto the mountain as possible, as quickly as possible. So that's the obstruction, is maybe like trying to shoot too high or something, or being careful not to make goal setting like a really fundamental part of the project, right? So that's essentially the reading I would give for that group of cards.
So the reading you have done is the who. We started with the who. We started with the action, the goal, and the problem.
Yeah, essentially, yeah. The second card I would call either tools or actions.
Tools or actions.
Yeah.
This is really interesting. Also, we talked about direction, in the reading, and trying to see which one is leading to where. In this card, we see the action of reaching the skies or going to the top. There is that we feel that desire of reaching, and I see this color as fire, like being motivation coming from passion, something regarding that. And I'm doing it without really looking at the titles. The Covener, for me, there is something, I feel like that white space in the heart area is interesting. There is no color, and for me it can be a potential. There is potential on something. Maybe I need to fill my heart with something. Maybe the passion consumed me fully. Maybe I need to learn something. There is something missing in the heart area, or maybe there is pure energy. We can explain it in different ways, and it's going so the direction. So if this is the first card, it is going to the passion, so maybe it will encounter passion some way, that young energy. I feel like this is really interesting. You were talking about chaos and order, and for me there is mastery that comes from this card. Mastery can be for good or bad, and depending the intention, but there is mastery coming here.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. It's a very powerful position that the Ophite is in.
Yes, and the way it is, it's a complete card. That's why it feels like we are massive. There is position in their body. Feels like something is accomplished. Yeah, and this card is so ethereal or so airy, that it feels that it can be, for me, it's a spark of idea, or it can be spirit ally. I see the spirit ally coming, and I would add maybe a fourth card to see what's its message, because it's going to a message. Oh my god, there are so many ways we can interpret the cards, like multiple ways. And that's why they are rich, because they have colors, they have positions, there is the stories, there is the guidebook you have added, and all this.
Yeah, they're
Now,
very open-ended, and I'd say that, like, in terms of interpreting them, like, the statements that are made in the guidebook are sort of poetic, and they're not meant to be like limiting in any way. I think that's very much about interpreting the images. It's a very important aspect of it.
yeah, exactly, and especially that you have shared it as a teaching and as feelings, and I feel like showing the guide, guide, being a guide for us to learn to meet these decks is really important, and after that, we need to master them in a way. Maybe we can talk about the workshop, on what we are planning to do in the workshop. If you can give us a few words about it.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I haven't really done a lot of planning. I was thinking, it would probably be good to structure it along the way that the guidebook is, to really like illuminate and create discussion around like the various ways the scaffoldings that built out the structure of the various faculties, and try to walk people through that. Maybe talk a little bit about the background of the project and stuff. Really, I think it would just be like a expansion of what we're doing now, and maybe we could walk through a few readings, or it's it's definitely still formulating. Definitely
Yes,
formulating, but yeah, we're doing it in August or something, right? So yeah,
yes,
I
exactly.
expect to be working on it up until then
Yes.
for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, and some people were asking about where when the deck will be delivered. Actually, we are printing our decks in Europe, and not only because of coronavirus, but because we prefer printing locally. So I live in Portugal, so I try to produce now more and more in Europe. So yeah, so it won't take months and months to have the decks. I can have them in July and start shipping them as soon as I have them. We put end of August just to make sure, but I'm pretty sure that I'm gonna have them before. The printers are really very friendly, very helpful, and yeah, I'm really happy to deal with them. Yeah, so the project is still going on for 11 days. Please support us, support the project, and we might meet you in our workshop on August. Max, do you have a last few words you want to share with us?
No, just that I'm really excited. I think this is an amazing feeling to have people starting to interact with them and talk about it more openly. And I want to do more of that. So I welcome any outreach or discussion that people have. I'd like to really be open to just talking about it and continuing the conversation.
Yes, thank you for those who have been here. Thank you, Sylvia. Yes, great news for printing. Absolutely beautiful art, Max. So she's saying. Also, the images are beautiful. Stacy is saying thank you for watching, and hope to meet you in our Kickstarter campaign. Have fun, and please make our project known. And see you soon. Bye, bye, Max.
Bye, everyone. Thanks, Osima. See you.